Welcome to our discussion of virtue ethics. We'll be taking a look at virtue ethics in 3 lectures, but 2 of which are going to be particularly about virtue ethics. Our 3rd lecture is going to be about feminism and feminist ethics of care, which is considered by some to be a subset of virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics gives us a different look at ethics from what we've seen so far. Thus far, we've focused on actions. That is, we focused on what types of things we should do in situations. Virtue ethics says that's a secondary question to what really we should be asking. According to virtue ethics, we should instead ask who is doing these things. Virtue ethics looks at the agent itself. What kind of person is an ethical person? What kind of person is virtuous? Virtue ethics, therefore, we could say, reverses the priority of questions. Who should we be is more important than what should we do. As such, we can consider virtue ethics to be more agent-centered than act-centered. This will have a profound effect on the way in which virtue ethics approaches moral dilemmas. Now, if we're going to get into virtue ethics, first we have to really discuss virtue. What is virtue? A virtue is a character quality that is morally praiseworthy to acquire and maintain. We can consider virtues to have 3 primary characteristics. A virtue is going to be a relatively fixed trait of character or mind. Now, even though it's going to be something we're going to say is relatively fixed, it is something that we can change. It is something that we can learn, that we can hone and craft. But it's going to be difficult for us to do. Virtue is going to involve certain psychological dispositions to think, feel, or act in certain ways in certain situations. We can also say that virtue may be able to be utilized as a criterion for judging moral worthiness. That is, we may be able to say that a person is virtuous or vicious. But furthermore, it's helpful for us to consider virtue as having 3 primary components. First, it's going to involve an intellectual component. That is, that we should have correct beliefs about ourselves and the world. It has an affective component. That is, that there are dispositions to feel and to express correct feelings, given the nature of the situation that we find ourselves in. Lastly, we consider a virtue to have a motivational or behavioral component. Basically, it's going to give us some type of disposition to act correctly or in certain ways. When all 3 things are present, we may be able to say that there is a kind of harmony between these parts. And the harmony between these virtues allows us, therefore, to call up, perhaps, or to utilize the virtue that's in our character, given that situation. And we should also consider that virtues can be moral or non-moral in nature. We may consider, for example, the term virtuoso. This is often a term that's used, for example, in music. If you think about, for example, a piano virtuoso, this is a person who has shown an exceptional excellence with regards to playing piano. We also have a very similar thing that occurs morally. We may be able to say that a virtuous person is a person who has honed and developed these particular virtuous characteristics or character traits that ultimately are things that we should emulate in some way. When all 3 components, some of these are considered cardinal virtues by some folks. A cardinal virtue is going to be a virtue that's considered to be more primary than other virtues. We see this, for example, in some Christian forms of this theory, where people may talk about things such as faith, hope, charity, and so forth as being primary virtues, or cardinal virtues. Now, in general, with regards to how we're discussing this theory, we don't see that there are superior virtues. Virtue theory develops out of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And Aristotle believes that all human activities aim at some end, which he calls the good. Now, whenever we look to do this, we look ultimately to achieve the highest good, which is the good that's most worthy amongst all the goods. Now, the highest good is an end for which all other ends are pursued, which is pursued in itself, and which is never pursued as a means to any other end. Therefore, we may say that the highest good is unconditionally complete and self-sufficient. Now, according to Aristotle, this highest good is what he calls eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a complex term to translate into English, and alternately it may be translated as happiness or flourishing. It seems to me, given my understanding of Aristotle, that the idea of flourishing, of living well, is perhaps a more appropriate consideration for eudaimonia. He believes that eudaimonia is the highest end because it meets all these characteristics. Now, Aristotle, if you recall, brought up the function argument, basically saying that there are certain things that are essential to understanding the nature of the thing itself. We saw this beforehand when we discussed natural law theory. Well, ultimately for Aristotle, it's going to be important for him to try to figure out what's essential to human beings. Well, in order for him to do that, he's going to ask us to consider our proper function or purpose. He believes that by establishing this, he's going to be able to show that the highest good, or eudaimonia, is appropriate to seek. Therefore, his argument follows. The highest good of human beings concerns their purpose or function. And the purpose of human or function or of human beings concerns what is distinctive of such beings. That is, that what's good for us as humans is good for us as humans. That may be different than what's good for my cat or my dog. Rationality is what's distinctive of humans, and hence its exercise is central in understanding the purpose or function of human beings. Again, Aristotle looks at the world and says, what is it that makes us different than the rest of the world? And for Aristotle, he believes that that comes down to our faculty of rationality. Furthermore, he believes that the highest good of human beings involves what he calls the rational exercise of the soul, or namely, the fact that we use rationality. Well, for using rationality, we may be able to state that the good of a thing is in its performing its function well, which for humans involves rational activity in accordance with, guided by virtue. That is, that if we're going to reason well, in order to try to find the highest good, if that's what's distinctive of us, then we have to make certain that we're honing this capability. Therefore, the highest good, or eudaimonia, is a life of rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. That is, a life of thought, of thoughtful action that's maybe constrained or guided by virtue, helps to define what's our highest good. To do this, Aristotle developed something he calls doctrine of the mean. For Aristotle, he defines a moral virtue as existing between two different extremes. Phronesis, or practical intelligence, helps us to figure out what the mean is. From the Nicomachean Ethics, virtue is concerned with feelings and action, in which excess and deficiency are in error and incur blame, while the intermediate condition is correct and wins praise, which are both proper features of virtue. Virtue, then, is a mean insofar as it aims at what is intermediate. So, let's take a look at a chart, for example. Vice exists on either side of the mean. It may show us when the virtue is deficient in terms of its presence, or excessive in terms of its presence. So, for example, consider the virtue of courage. When a person is not courageous, we may say that they're acting cowardly. But when a person seems to be acting too courageously, they may act rash in that situation, and therefore possibly endanger themselves and otherwise. As you can see from this chart, Aristotle believes that the mean between excess and defect, or deficiency, is in essence where the virtue exists. Furthermore, Aristotle argues that when we have one virtue, we must have them all. That the virtues are reciprocal in nature. So, for example, if we're going to be courageous, that we also understand something about temperance. That is, that we understand how we can moderate maybe our courage so that we don't become rash or cowardly. Now, this is significantly different from a single virtue thesis, which would tell us that, for example, that all virtues are part of one psychological state. Aristotle is saying that all these things exist, and that they exist in a certain form of relationship to one another. Therefore, facts about particular virtuous agents, and in particular about facts about virtuous character traits possessed by those agents, are going to be more basic than facts about right conduct and what explain why an action is right or wrong. Virtue, for Aristotle, is going to be primary to right action. It's going to be prior to right action. That is, we're going to define our theory of the right based on virtue. This leads us to consider what an ideal virtuous agent would do. And when we consider that, that brings us to our theory in a nutshell. An action performed in a certain situation is right if and only if it is an action that a virtuous agent acting in character would perform in the situation in question. And when we think about this, this doesn't seem very alien to us at all. You may recall a fad that occurred within America within the early 90s, or within the 90s and the early 2000s. You may have even had one of these. You may recall the bracelets or the t-shirts that said things such as WWJD, or what would Jesus do? Some people consider Jesus to be perhaps an ideal virtuous agent. And they may ask themselves in certain situations, what would Jesus do in this situation? And therefore they may try to pattern their behavior based on that. We could replace Jesus with any other person who may be considered to be a virtuous agent, whether that may be a parent, a role model as a child, a hero such as Superman, a courageous person who existed, like Gandhi, for example. So this practice of asking, what would a person do in this situation, a person who we praise, a person who we hold in high esteem, who would be considered to be virtuous, is not an alien question from us. Virtue ethicists believe that it's perhaps the most important question about ethics. Again, who are we and why are we doing this? Our theory of the good, again, is that eudaimonia is the highest good in human life. All other goods derive, ultimately, or are evaluated in terms of how they contribute to happiness or to flourishing. Now, when we consider the theory structurally, we get to some very interesting things. We may be able to say that non-moral goodness, or eudaimonia, leads to virtue, which then leads to right conduct. Or we may be able to say that virtue leads us to our theory of right conduct and non-moral goodness. Our structure in this theory is not so rigid